The UK and the US may have had comparable economies before World War II, but nowadays, the UK economy cannot hold a candle to the US. In this video of Economics Simplified, we are going to take an in-depth look at the economies of the UK and the US. First, let's start with some basic numbers, then we shall look at more complex data. The US has a GDP of $20.8 trillion and the UK has a GDP of $2.638 trillion. Both countries have taken a hit in 2020 due to COVID, but COVID has arguably been much worse on the economy of the UK, causing it to contract by 11%, while the US shall contract by 3%. This may have to do with the relative firepower that the Bank of England has compared to the Fed, allowing the Fed to spend and recover the economy quicker due to their larger monetary and fiscal firepower. If you don't know what I mean by this, check out our video on the US debt, where I go more in depth on this. Now, let's look at the average growth rate of the UK and the US over the last 11 years from 2009 to 2020, so that we can include both the financial crisis and the COVID crisis in our calculations. The UK grew by 0.18% year on year on average, while the US grew year on year by 1.5%. Now let's look at the total GDP change from 2009 to 2020 for both countries. The UK's economy shrank by $410 billion since 2009, while the US economy has grown by $6.35 trillion since 2009. But to be fair, the decrease of the value of the pound has had an effect on the UK GDP. And if we were to look at it in terms of purchasing power parity, the UK economy has grown by $773 billion since 2009. Now, what about the individual? The British make $39,229 in terms of GDP per capita and make $44,288 in terms of purchasing power parity. And the American makes $63,000 per capita in terms of GDP. But this skews the data by taking the average. How, you ask? Well, because the Gini coefficient of the UK is 33.5, while that of their transatlantic counterparts is 46.5. This means that those $39,229 are spread much more evenly than in the US. Meaning that the median or the middle of the bunch makes about $48,672 a year in the US, a difference of almost $15,000 from the GDP per capita, whereas the median income in the UK was $41,593 as of April 2019. Now, how do they rank globally? The US stands in at 2nd% in PPP GDP and 1st in terms of GDP. The UK stands in at 5th in GDP and 9th in terms of PPP GDP. If you don't know what is purchasing power parity, PPP, check out this video where I go in detail on the topic. Now, what about their HDI, Human Development Index? The UK has an HDI of 0.920 and the US has an HDI of 0.926. But what about unemployment? Well, the UK wins this by a huge margin with an unemployment rate of 4.8% as of August 2020, while the US unemployment rate is at 8.4%. But this number hides the policy differences in how to deal with unemployment between the Atlantic. In the US, unemployment rose quickly to heights that we can't even imagine, but it went down just as quickly. Meanwhile, in Europe, the policies of employee retention were much stronger, and some countries already had systems in place to deal with sudden uncertainty. This means that unemployment would have always been lower in the UK, but once these unemployment reducing policies that are extremely taxing on the budgets of European countries are removed, unemployment may actually go up, or at least high unemployment would stay longer than in the US. The US imports a lot, and that's not necessarily a bad thing. It shows how developed a country is. Usually, the more you import, the more consumerist economy you develop. So, let's look at the data. The US imported $2.4 trillion worth of goods in 2019 and exported $1.64 trillion worth of goods in 2019. This means the trade deficit is at $850 billion, but this doesn't really tell us much. So I'm going to use two different data sets, trade deficit to GDP and imports per capita. So the US trade deficit to GDP is 4% and the UK trade deficit to GDP is 1.4%. This means that as an economy, the US imports more than it exports compared to UK. Both are reasonably low trade deficits to GDP, but definitely nothing to worry about. But what about imports per capita? Well, the UK imports $13,000 per capita, while the US imports $7,500 per capita. So the US imports less per capita but has a higher trade deficit to GDP ratio. This is because we could consider the UK balance sheets as well more balanced, meaning that they relatively export as much as they import. whereas the US does not do so. This may have to do with the varying needs of the population of the different countries. The fact that the UK is a relatively stable trading partner across the channel, although Brexit might have screwed that up, and maybe the policies of the governments in question. Another issue that we see commonly pop up is the debt issue in developed countries. So let's look at some data. The US has a debt of $27.5 trillion, dollars, a massive number to be sure. But how much of it does it actually have to pay back every year? Well, only $391 billion, dollars, or an interest rate of only 1.4%. The US has a debt to GDP ratio of 129.59%. But when we look at the total revenue to interest paid yearly, we see that it is only 11% of the revenue or only 4.9% of the US expenditure. In fact, the US spends twice as much on its defense, three times as much on its social security, and four times as much on Medicaid due to the size of their economy. Well, what about deficits? The US had a massive deficit of 15.2% in 2020, and again, the Fed is not dumb. They know that because of them being the leading economic superpower, they have considerable leverage when managing debts and deficits. Compare this to the UK, who had a deficit of 2.8%, more than five times smaller than the US, and you see what I mean. The UK simply cannot spend as much as the US, even on a percentage basis, although they were able to do during the aftermath of the 2009 financial crisis, with deficit as a percent of GDP reaching 8.1% in 2012. So the UK is clearly the winner in this regard, with them consistently keeping their deficit below 3% since 2016. Although I don't really see this as an achievement. As you may have noticed, this whole video was an excuse for me to use different data sets and various economic parameters such as the average growth rate over 11 years, PPP per capita, Gini coefficient, median income versus GDP per capita, unemployment rates, trade deficit to GDP, import per capita, interest paid to revenue and expenses, and trade deficits. I shall link some more data below, and if you want more videos like this comparing various countries through new and exciting economic parameters, hit the like so I know. This was Economic Simplified, and see you next video.